Everyone thought he'd lost his mind when a former Marine bought an abandoned Mafia mansion for just $99. Locals whispered that the place was cursed, the kind of house where men vanished and sins were buried in the walls. But when he broke through a hidden staircase beneath the floorboards, what he discovered inside stunned the entire town, a secret that would turn darkness into light. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The storm had passed over Port Hollow, leaving the sea gray and still, the kind of morning when even God seems to be holding his breath. The morning fog hung low over the coastal town of Port Hollow, Maine, turning the world into a quiet watercolor of gray and silver. Ethan Cole leaned against the railing of his small rented porch, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on the restless sea that mirrored the war inside him. He was 38, a former Marine with the bearing of someone who'd been carved out of discipline and regret. His once clean haircut had grown uneven, brown hair streaked with salt and neglect. A faint scar ran from his temple down to the edge of his beard, a pale souvenir from a mission gone wrong somewhere halfway across the world. His shoulders were still square, his posture still military, but his eyes, gray like winter smoke, had lost the spark of a man expecting tomorrow to be any different from today. At his feet lay Valor, his German shepherd, a 7-year-old with black and tan fur dulled slightly by sea air. The dog was broad-chested, powerful, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to read every shift in Ethan's silence. Valor had been trained for combat search and rescue, but now he lived a quieter mission, guarding what was left of a broken man. The bond between them was wordless yet absolute. When Ethan couldn't sleep, Valor would lie beside the bed, head on his boots, as if to remind him that loyalty wasn't something the war could take. Ethan's mornings were routine: black coffee, a long walk down the shore, and silence that neither the ocean nor memory could break. The apartment he rented was a single room above a bait shop run by Sarah Langford, a widow in her 40s with a lean frame, salt blonde hair always tied back, and sharp blue eyes that noticed everything but judged nothing. Sarah had the kind of tired beauty that came from surviving too many storms, both literal and emotional. She greeted Ethan each morning with a simple nod. She liked him, quiet, respectful, paid on time, but she also saw in him the look she once saw in her late husband before he drowned, a man trying to outpace ghosts. That morning, as Ethan thumbed through the folded newspaper she left by his door, one small ad caught his eye near the bottom of the classifieds. Mansion for sale, $90, must vacate immediately. The absurdity of it made him pause. $99. He checked the date twice, half expecting it to be a misprint, but no, it was real. The address listed was on the far edge of town, a stretch known as Hollow Point, where the fog was thickest and the cliffs dropped sheer into the Atlantic. Later, when Sarah handed him his usual cup of coffee downstairs, she noticed the paper tucked under his arm. "You're not actually thinking of going there, are you?" she asked, her tone half amusement, half concern. Ethan shrugged, a habit he used in place of conversation. "Maybe I am." Sarah set her hands on her hips, the faintest trace of a smirk forming. "That place belonged to Salvatore Bellini. You know who that was?" He nodded. "Mafia guy, smuggler. Went missing, right?" "Missing, murdered, cursed, take your pick." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "People say no one stays a night there without hearing things. A fisherman claimed he saw lights in the windows last winter. The cops checked. House was empty, always is." Ethan looked past her, toward the horizon where the fog was thickening again. Maybe ghosts like company. Sarah sighed, but there was a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "You're a fool, Marine, but I guess fools are the only ones who ever change things." By noon, Ethan was on the road. The truck he drove was an old Ford pickup, dented and salt-stained, much like its owner. Valor sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears twitching with every sound. The drive took them past the outskirts of town, where the asphalt cracked and the houses thinned into wild coastal scrub. The sign for Hollow Point leaned at an angle, letters half erased by years of salt wind. When they reached the iron gates, the engine idled to a low growl. The mansion loomed ahead, a 3-story relic of another century, its stone walls veined with ivy and rust. The tall windows were black as eyes that had seen too much. Seagulls circled above, their cries sharp against the hush of the waves below. Ethan stepped out and stared for a long moment. There was something about the place that resonated with the hollow inside him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Decay knew decay. The lock on the gate was rusted but loose. He pushed it open, the hinges screeching like a warning. Valor followed close, tail low, sniffing the ground. The air smelled of brine, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like blood long dried. As they approached the front steps, Ethan noticed a small brass plaque near the door, half covered in moss. Villa Bellini, 1923. The main doors groaned open at his touch. Inside, the air was still and cold, heavy with the scent of dust and sea. The entrance hall was vast, marble floor cracked, chandelier missing half its crystals. Faded frescoes clung to the ceiling, cherubs peeling into ghosts. Ethan's boots echoed like distant gunfire. He had walked through ruins before, but never one that seemed to breathe. He found an old generator in the side shed and managed to coax it back to life. Weak light flickered through the hall, revealing a grand staircase and an enormous portrait of Bellini himself, a man in his 50s, square-jawed, dark eyes that watched like a judge. The signature in the corner read, Maria Bellini, 1958, so his wife had painted him. The brushwork was gentle, loving, strange for a man everyone called a monster. Ethan sat down on a step, Valor beside him. He felt the weight of silence pressing in, the same silence that used to follow him home from war zones. He rubbed his hands over his face, whispering, "You picked one hell of a place, Cole." Valor whined softly, resting his head on Ethan's knee. The gesture stirred something fragile in him, a memory of his daughter's hand doing the same years ago before the phone call that ended his old life. He stood abruptly, unwilling to sink into that memory again. A sudden sound broke the stillness. A soft clatter, like a door swinging shut upstairs. Valor's ears shot up. Ethan's hand instinctively went to where a rifle used to hang. He exhaled, forcing his pulse to slow. "Wind," he muttered, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He moved through the lower rooms, dust puffing under each step. There was furniture under white sheets, a grand piano by the window, and a faint scent of salt and decay that clung to everything. The place felt abandoned, yet watched. He touched the piano's lid. A thin line of clean wood appeared under the dust, and for a heartbeat, he could almost hear a note resonate in the silence. When the daylight began to fade, Ethan stood by the broken window, looking out toward the sea. The tide was high, waves breaking against the cliffs like thunder. "What do you think, boy?" he said softly. "Haunted enough for us?" Valor wagged his tail once but didn't take his eyes off the shadowed stairs. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and frowned. There, halfway up, a faint reflection glimmered, metal catching the last of the dying light before disappearing. He took a step forward, but the sound came again. A slow, deliberate creak from somewhere above. "Stay close," he whispered. And together, the Marine and his loyal dog began to climb the stairs into the dark. The sea was restless that night, clawing against the rocks below Hollow Point like an animal trying to get in. Ethan stood by the broken window of the mansion, the faint hum of the generator casting a yellow halo around him. The air smelled of wet salt and something else, old metal, oil, decay. He'd slept in worse places, but never one that felt so awake. Valor lay near the staircase, ears flicking with every groan of the old house. The wind outside howled like the far-off whine of artillery. It made Ethan think of Fallujah, of the burnt sand, the echo of mortars, and the sound of men screaming names they'd never call again. He had bought the house that morning, signed a thin stack of legal papers at the Port Hollow courthouse. The clerk, Mark Hendricks, was a man in his 50s with a gray beard that seemed to hide a permanent smirk. He wore suspenders, smelled faintly of tobacco, and treated the entire transaction like a joke. $99 for a mansion, huh? Guess it's your funeral, Marine, he said, as he slid the keys across the counter. His tone was playful, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Mark had grown up in this town. He'd heard the stories. The Bellini place wasn't a home. It was a scar on the coastline. By afternoon, Ethan had driven up the hill with Valor and the few possessions he owned, a duffel bag, an old photo of his family, a folded Marine flag, and a toolbox. The generator sputtered to life as if reluctant to wake, but soon the house flickered with weak light. It wasn't much, yet for the first time in years, Ethan felt a strange sense of purpose. Not peace, not yet, but something close. He began cleaning. Each room he entered carried the smell of time, mildew, dust, salt. The dining room table was long enough for 20, now covered in a gray shroud of abandonment. Crystal glasses sat upside down on a sideboard, and a single fork rested near an overturned plate, as if someone had once left in a hurry. The wallpaper peeled in vertical tears, exposing the bone-colored plaster beneath. The walls whispered stories he didn't yet understand. At nightfall, Ethan sat by the staircase with Valor at his feet. He had no plan, no job, no family, just this ruin and the sound of waves. His mind drifted, unbidden, to his wife, Claire. She had been 29 when she died, a nurse with auburn hair that smelled faintly of citrus. He remembered her smile, the way she laughed when he tried to dance, how she once said, "If you can survive war, you can survive peace." She'd been wrong about that. Peace was what killed him slowly. A sound interrupted his thoughts, a dull, rhythmic thud like something knocking behind the walls. Valor rose immediately, hackles up, growling low. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from his belt and scanned the hallway. The sound came again, this time from below. The basement. The entrance was hidden behind a warped wooden door near the kitchen. The hinges screamed as he opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air growing colder, damp with the scent of earth and rust. "Stay," he whispered to Valor, but the dog ignored him and followed close behind. The beam of light cut through the black, revealing shelves filled with jars of nails, broken tools, and wine bottles turned to vinegar. Near the far wall, a section of bricks looked newer than the rest, cleaner, smoother, as though someone had rebuilt it recently. Ethan's instincts sharpened. He stepped closer, brushing his hand along the surface. Hollow. He tapped it lightly with the handle of a wrench. The sound that came back wasn't solid stone. It was empty. Someone had sealed something behind it. He knelt, tracing the mortar lines. The craftsmanship was deliberate but rushed. Whoever did this wanted it hidden, not preserved. He fetched a small hammer and chisel from his toolbox and began to work. The metallic rhythm filled the basement, steady and harsh. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat. Dust rose in thin clouds, and after several minutes, one brick loosened and fell away, revealing a cavity. Inside was a small room, barely large enough to stand in, its walls lined with dark stains and forgotten relics. An old wooden chair lay broken on its side. On the far wall hung a single painting, a family portrait. A man with dark hair and stern eyes, a woman in pearls, and a young girl with ribbons in her hair. The brushwork was Italian, delicate. The name in the corner read, Maria Bellini, 1958. Ethan wiped the dust from the frame. The man, Salvatore Bellini, stared back at him with unsettling calm, eyes like dark oil that caught the light but reflected nothing. Beneath the portrait, half buried in debris, something glinted. Ethan reached down and pulled out a small revolver wrapped in cloth. The metal was cold and silver, the grip engraved with initials, S.B. On the barrel, faint words had been etched by hand, "For those who will never know the truth." The weight of it was heavier than steel. He turned the gun in his hand, thumb brushing the trigger guard. The design was old, pre-war, and custom-made. This wasn't a weapon meant for combat, it was personal. He could almost feel the echo of its last use. A gun like that wasn't hidden for safety, it was buried to hide shame. Valor whined softly behind him, the sound low and uneasy. Ethan looked up at the portrait again. The woman's painted smile seemed to tremble in the flickering light. For a moment, the shadows around her eyes deepened, giving her face an almost pleading expression. Ethan blinked hard, shaking off the illusion. "Just old paint," he muttered. Still, as he stood in that hidden room, something shifted inside him. The war had taught him to read signs, the subtle tension before an ambush, the silence before a shot. The house had that same tension, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for him to understand something. He placed the revolver back into the cloth, carried it upstairs, and laid it gently on the dining table. The generator sputtered again, lights dimming for a moment before returning. The chandelier above him swayed slightly, though there was no wind. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, He saw the Bellini family watching him from the dark. He thought about the inscription on the gun. Who was the truth meant for? What had been hidden so carefully that even time had tried to forget it? He rose before dawn. The sea outside was still black, the horizon faintly red. He poured himself stale coffee, leaned against the cold counter, and stared at the revolver. "You left something unfinished," he said quietly to the silence. "Didn't you, Salvatore?" Valor padded to the window, nose pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on something outside. Ethan followed his gaze. In the distance, near the edge of the cliff, he could just make out the faint outline of a figure standing motionless against the fog. When he blinked, it was gone. The morning after the fog returned, thick as breath on glass, Ethan woke to the sound of Valor barking downstairs. Sharp, urgent, not his usual warning bark. It echoed off the old walls, rattling dust from the rafters. He rose from the couch where he'd slept, his body stiff, dreams still clinging to him like sea mist. The dream had been of footsteps, of someone calling his name from under the floorboards. He'd woken to silence until Valor broke it. He found the dog at the base of the main staircase, pawing furiously at one of the lower steps. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, crouching beside him. Valor whined, nose pressed against the wood, tail low but wagging. Ethan touched the step. It felt colder than the others. When he tapped it lightly with a wrench, the sound came back hollow. He remembered Bellini's hidden room in the basement, and a cold prickle ran down his spine. "You've got good instincts," he whispered to Valor. "Better than mine." The step was covered by a cracked wooden panel, once painted white but now stained by decades of damp air. He fetched a crowbar and pried it loose. Beneath it lay a metal plate, dusted with grime and the faint scent of oil. A keyhole sat in its center, shaped like a small sunburst. No key in sight. Ethan sat back on his heels, thinking. Whoever had built this hadn't meant it to be found, but hadn't meant it to be lost either. He ran his hand along the underside of the staircase and found, by accident, a small envelope wedged between two beams. It was yellowed and brittle, sealed with a wax stamp cracked by time. The handwriting was elegant, looping in the old Italian style. For Julia, March 14th. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a small birthday card, written in a woman's hand. "To my dearest Julia, the light in this house and in our hearts. Never forget, love leaves marks that time cannot erase." Beneath the card was a tiny brass key, its bow carved in the same sunburst pattern as the keyhole. "March 14th, Ethan murmured. "Julia, the daughter." He fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a faint click, a sound that felt almost alive in the stillness. Slowly, he lifted the metal hatch. A rush of cold, stale air escaped. Inside was a narrow iron safe, its hinges resisting before giving way. Dust poured out like ash. He aimed his flashlight inside. Folders, dozens of them, leather-bound, stamped with dates, 1951, 1954, 1956. Beneath them, a thick ledger wrapped in red ribbon and an old photograph in a cracked frame. The picture showed a man, a woman, and a little girl with dark curls holding a wooden horse. He didn't need to read the names on the back to know. The Bellinis. On top of the ledger rested a small notebook, its cover blackened by mold but still intact. Ethan opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was meticulous, almost ceremonial. The first page began, "To whomever finds this, my name is Salvatore Bellini. I have done terrible things, but I cannot let the blood I spilled define the rest of my name. This house was built on shadow, but I intended it to end in light." Ethan read for what felt like hours. The entries detailed Bellini's empire of smuggling during the Prohibition era. Whiskey, then weapons, then worse. He'd made millions while men starved. But somewhere near the end of his life, after his wife's death, he had begun to change. He'd created an anonymous charity fund, Casa della Luce, the House of Light, to shelter orphaned children of war and poverty. It had never opened. Before Bellini could finish it, his rivals betrayed him. He vanished. The last entry was a single line, the ink darker, as if pressed by a trembling hand. "If I'm gone, let this light survive, for those who will never know the truth." Ethan sat back against the stair, the notebook heavy in his hands. The air felt thick, like the house itself was listening. The words reminded him of letters he'd written to his daughter while deployed, letters that never reached her, Words meant to explain why he missed birthdays, school plays, first dances, words that became meaningless once she was gone. He pressed the notebook to his chest and closed his eyes. "You tried to make it right," he whispered. "Maybe that's enough." A knock startled him. 3 short raps against the front door. He froze. Valor growled, a low rumble like thunder. Ethan stood and moved to the foyer, flashlight in one hand, the revolver from the basement in the other. Outside stood a man in a worn brown jacket and flat cap, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He looked about 60, tall but stooped slightly, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder. His face was long and weathered, with a white mustache trimmed neat. "Name's Howard Caldwell," the man said through the cracked door. "You're the Marine who bought the Bellini place?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Caldwell extended a business card through the gap. It read, "Howard Caldwell, attorney at law, Port Hollow. I handled the Bellini estate, or what was left of it, decades ago," Caldwell continued. His voice was gravelly but calm, carrying the weight of too many years buried in secrets. "When I heard someone finally bought this place, I figured you might want to know what you've stepped into." Ethan opened the door a little wider. "You're late to the warning party," he said dryly. Caldwell smiled faintly. "You wouldn't have listened anyway. Men like you never do." Ethan motioned him in. Caldwell stepped across the threshold, eyes scanning the room like a detective revisiting a crime scene. "Still smells the same," he muttered. "Salt, smoke, and regret." Ethan showed him the notebook and the folders. The older man's face changed. First surprise, then something close to reverence. "Good Lord," Caldwell whispered. "I thought these were gone. He told me once he'd destroyed everything. Guess he lied to me too." "What is this, really?" Ethan asked. "His confession," Caldwell said softly, "and his redemption. The Casa della Luce fund was real. He poured nearly everything into it before he disappeared. The money's still in limbo, held in a trust that no one's claimed in 60 years. Ethan stared at the safe again, at the quiet darkness within. "So you're saying this matters?" Caldwell nodded slowly. "More than you think. But I'll warn you, Marine, every secret you dig up in this house comes with teeth. Bellini's enemies didn't all die with him." The clock on the mantel ticked once, a hollow sound that filled the silence between them. Caldwell gathered a few of the documents into his satchel. "Let me look into this," he said. "If there's still a way to bring this fund back to life, maybe we can finish what the old man started." When the lawyer left, the fog outside had thickened again, erasing the cliff's edge. Ethan stood by the window, watching until Caldwell's car lights vanished into the gray. Valor sat beside him, ears twitching. "House of Light," Ethan murmured. "Maybe it's time this place learned how to live again." A gust of wind pushed against the door, and from somewhere deep within the walls, faint as breath, came the sound of a piano key being struck once, soft, sorrowful, waiting. Rain had come to Port Hollow before dawn, slicing through the fog and silver threads that shimmered beneath the headlights of passing cars. The sea beyond the cliffs groaned with the weight of the storm, crashing against the rocks like something alive. Inside the old Bellini mansion, Ethan Cole sat at the dining table, a single lamp flickering beside him. The room smelled of damp wood, ink, and dust disturbed from years of silence. Spread before him were the files from the safe. Dozens of pages covered in Bellini's handwriting, ledgers of names and numbers, lists of shipments that once fed an empire built on crime and shadow. Valor slept nearby, his head resting on his paws, one ear twitching with each rumble of thunder. Ethan hadn't slept in 2 nights. His mind was a battlefield, memories of war, his wife's voice, Bellini's words in the notebook. "If I'm gone, let this light survive." Those words felt like a mission, one he hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. By morning, he was driving through town in his old truck, the folders secured in a canvas bag on the passenger seat. Howard Caldwell had asked to meet him at the courthouse. The storm had thinned to drizzle, the streets slick and gleaming. People stared as he passed. The stranger, the Marine, the man who bought the cursed house for $99. The courthouse loomed ahead, a relic of red brick and white pillars. Inside, The air was thick with the smell of wet coats and floor polish. Ethan found Caldwell waiting in the records office, his brown overcoat still dripping from the rain. The old man looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than the day before, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination. "Morning, Marine," Caldwell greeted, setting down his hat. "You look like hell." Ethan gave a faint grin. "Feels about right." The lawyer gestured to a table covered in open folders and legal books. "I went through everything I could find about the Bellini Trust. It's real, all right. The Casa della Luce Foundation was officially registered in 1958, but never activated. Bellini moved millions into an offshore account under a false name, then vanished before transferring it to the fund. The state froze the assets. Technically, it still exists, just sleeping." Ethan leaned closer. "Can it be reactivated?" Caldwell hesitated, fingers tapping the folder. "Legally, yes, but it'll attract attention. People still remember the Bellini family, some of them with fear, some with hate. And if you start digging, you might find that the past digs back." Ethan sat back, eyes narrowing. "You think someone's still protecting whatever's left of Bellini's secrets?" The lawyer sighed. "Let's just say corruption doesn't rot easily in this town." As they talked, the door creaked open. A woman stepped inside, tall, early 30s, hair tied in a wet knot, wearing a dark wool coat over jeans and boots. Her features were sharp but not unfriendly. Olive skin, green eyes that held the confidence of someone used to fighting her way into rooms. "You must be the Marine," she said. "I'm Isabella Moreno, investigative journalist, the Port Hollow Chronicle." Ethan glanced at Caldwell, whose jaw tightened. "You called the press?" "I didn't," Caldwell replied, frowning, "which means someone else did." Isabella set a recorder on the table and gave a quick professional smile. "Relax, I'm not here to ruin your day. I just want the truth. You found something in that house, didn't you?" Ethan's instinct screamed no, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp to lie too easily. He studied her for a moment. She wasn't the type to scare easily. There was a kind of fire in her that reminded him of the medics he'd served with, people who walked into danger because they had to, not because they liked it. "Depends on what you mean by something," he said finally. "Documents, records, anything that could explain what happened to Bellini." Caldwell spoke before Ethan could. "Miss Moreno, this isn't a story. It's history best left alone." She smiled faintly. "That's what everyone says before the truth comes out." Ethan folded his arms. "And what's your angle?" She shrugged. "My father was a dock worker here in the 70s. He used to tell me stories about the Bellini men. Said they ran the port long after Salvatore disappeared. When I heard someone bought the house, I figured the ghosts might start talking again." Ethan didn't answer. Caldwell muttered something under his breath and began packing up the files. But when Isabella reached for one of the ledgers, Valor, who had followed Ethan inside, let out a low growl. She froze, startled, then slowly pulled her hand back. "Protective," she said softly. "Good dog." Ethan gave a brief nod. He's not fond of surprises. When they stepped outside, the rain had turned to mist again, wrapping the courthouse steps in pale light. Isabella walked beside them. "You can keep your secrets, Mr. Cole," she said quietly. "But if what you found can help this town remember that Bellini wasn't just a monster, you might want to think about sharing it." Ethan stopped by his truck. "Why do you care?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because my father died on that dock, the one Bellini built, and I never got to know whether the man who caused so much pain ever tried to make it right." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog like a figure in a story half finished. Caldwell sighed. "You see what I mean? Once you stir the ashes, you start fires." That night, back at the mansion, the storm returned in full. Wind screamed through the cracks, and the chandelier above the hall swayed like a pendulum. Ethan lit a fire in the old stone hearth. The flames danced across the room, casting long shadows over the walls where portraits once hung. He sat beside the safe again, reading Bellini's letters. Letters written not to gangsters, but to his daughter Julia. Words of guilt, of hope, of desperate love. Valor lay beside him, but his ears kept twitching toward the window. Outside, the storm was growing violent, branches thrashing, waves booming below the cliffs. Then, over the wind, Ethan heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights flashed briefly through the rain. Someone had driven up the path. Ethan rose, heart hammering. He moved to the window, careful not to stand in the light. The truck stopped just short of the gate. A figure stepped out, tall, wearing a dark coat, hat pulled low. They looked toward the mansion, unmoving. Valor growled deep in his chest. Ethan reached for the revolver on the table. For a moment, the thunder drowned everything. When it passed, the figure was gone. The gate stood open, swinging in the wind. Ethan whispered, "Looks like the past heard us knocking." And somewhere in the distance, faint but distinct, a second car engine started, one that hadn't come up the road. It had been waiting. Dawn crept slowly across Port Hollow, painting the battered coastline in tones of cold gold and smoke. The storm had finally broken, leaving puddles that mirrored the gray sky and a silence so fragile that even the wind seemed hesitant to return. Inside the Bellini mansion, the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Ethan Cole sat before it, revolver still on the table beside him, the files spread open like the aftermath of confession. Valor lay curled near his boots, his fur still damp from the night's chaos. The dog had not slept. Every sound still made his ears twitch, as though the house itself whispered things too soft for human ears. Ethan hadn't seen who had come to the gate the night before, but he knew now it hadn't been imagination. Footprints had marked the gravel path, one set heavy, deliberate. He followed them to the gate at sunrise, only to find tire tracks leading back toward town. Whoever it was, they'd watched and then left. But why? He poured himself black coffee from a pot gone bitter overnight, staring into it as if it might show him the answers. The mansion was colder than usual, shadows long and quiet. He turned to Valor. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's go find out how much of this town still remembers what truth looks like." By the time he reached the courthouse, the clouds had started to thin, a pale sun glinting weakly over the harbor. Howard Caldwell was already waiting, leaning against his old sedan, trench coat buttoned to the throat, hat pulled low. His face looked older than it had the day before, as though he hadn't slept either. "I had visitors last night, too," the lawyer said quietly as Ethan approached. "Someone tried to break into my office. They didn't take anything, just left a warning." He pulled from his coat pocket a torn scrap of paper, words scrawled in red ink. "Leave the dead buried." Ethan's jaw clenched. "They're scared of what we'll find." Caldwell nodded grimly. "Fear has long roots in this town, and the Bellini name still makes men sweat." Before Ethan could reply, another car pulled up. Isabella Moreno stepped out, her dark coat catching the faint drizzle, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "I think we need to talk," she said, holding up a folder. "Someone sent me this anonymously last night. Photos of Bellini's offshore accounts, letters of transfer, and a note. The house still lives." Ethan frowned. "You think someone's helping us?" "Or leading us somewhere," Isabella said. Her green eyes met his. "Either way, it's too late to stop now." They drove together back to the mansion. The ride was silent, except for the hum of the tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic thud of Ethan's heart. Valor sat upright in the back, eyes fixed on the passing landscape as if guarding against ghosts. When they arrived, the house looked different under morning light, less haunted, but no less alive. Isabella stepped inside and inhaled sharply. "God," she murmured, "it feels like it's been holding its breath for decades." Ethan led them to the dining room. Files, ledgers, and Bellini's notebook covered the table. Caldwell carefully unfolded the newly found documents and compared signatures, tracing lines of connection between Bellini's accounts and government archives. "This," he said softly, "is proof. The Casa della Luce fund wasn't just a story. The money's real. And if we can validate this chain of ownership, the foundation can be reactivated." Isabella was silent, scanning the last pages of Bellini's diary. When she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "Listen to this. Redemption cannot undo the past. It only asks that pain be turned toward mercy. Let this house be a shelter for those with no home left to return to." The room fell quiet. Even Valor seemed to sense the weight of those words. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a quiet, long-delayed click, like the moment a soldier finally sets down his weapon after years of carrying it. Then, "Let's make it happen," he said. They spent the next hours gathering everything into boxes and filing evidence for official review. Caldwell drafted affidavits, Isabella photographed documents, Ethan contacted the town clerk to petition for the fund's reinstatement. The process was tedious, bureaucratic, but each paper signed felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something bigger than himself. When dusk returned, the three of them stood outside the house, watching the sun sink into the Atlantic, sky burning orange against the ruins of storm clouds. Caldwell lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like memory. "You know," he said, "I was a young lawyer when Bellini disappeared. My father told me to never speak his name, said it was cursed. I think maybe he was wrong." Ethan smiled faintly. "Curses only stick if no one fights them." Isabella looked up at the windows where the last light of day shimmered against the old glass. "What will you do with the place?" Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. "Finish what he started. The money will go into the fund, but the house stays open, for kids with nowhere else to go. It's what Bellini wanted. Maybe it's what I needed too." Caldwell nodded. "You're a good man, Marine." Ethan shook his head. "Just trying to be better than I was." They stayed until darkness reclaimed the cliffs. When the lawyer and journalist finally left, Ethan remained alone on the porch with Valor. The air was cool, the sea below restless but calm. He looked toward the horizon, where a single lighthouse beam cut across the night, steady, unwavering. Inside, he found the piano room again. The dust had settled thick on the keys, yet when he touched one gently, the note rang out clear and sad. It echoed through the hall like a voice finally allowed to speak. He whispered to the emptiness, "You kept your promise, old man." Valor wagged his tail, pressing his head against Ethan's leg. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting them in amber and gold. For the first time in years, Ethan felt warmth that didn't come from flame. It came from within, from the quiet knowledge that even broken men could build sanctuaries. Weeks later, Port Hollow would speak in hushed tones about the miracle at the Bellini mansion. A foundation revived, children housed, a soldier who refused to let darkness win. Newspapers printed Isabella's article, "The House of Light, How Redemption Found Its Way Home." But that night, before the story became legend, Ethan sat by the window watching the moon rise over the Atlantic, soft waves glimmering silver below. He thought of Claire and his daughter, of Bellini and his sins, of the many ways a man could try to make peace with ghosts. He closed his eyes and whispered, "They're home now." Outside, the tide whispered back, and for the first time, the house didn't sound haunted. It sounded alive. There are stories that don't end when the last page closes. They live on quietly, in the choices we make, in the way we forgive, and in the small mercies that change everything. The House of Light is one of those stories. It reminds us that redemption is never beyond reach, that even the darkest walls can still reflect grace when someone dares to open the windows again. Ethan's journey wasn't about restoring a mansion. It was about restoring faith, not just in God, but in humanity. The same God who turns storms into calm seas can turn our brokenness into purpose, if only we let him. Sometimes the miracle we pray for isn't thunder and lightning. It's the quiet courage to start again. It's the whisper in your heart that says, "You are not finished yet." Maybe you've carried your own ghosts, loss, guilt, pain, things left unsaid. But as Ethan learned, God doesn't ask us to be perfect. He asks us to keep walking toward the light, even when we can't yet see where it leads. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about trusting that what was once empty can bloom again. If this story touched something inside you, share it. Leave a comment about the light you found in your own journey. Subscribe to Soulful Stories so we can keep walking this path together, where broken hearts find grace and lost souls find home. May the Lord bless you, keep you, and remind you that even in your darkest night, His light still burns, quietly, faithfully, waiting for you to see it again.